Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon, whether you're here in the theater with us or joining us through our Facebook or YouTube channels, and a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. Before we hear from William Hyland Jr. about George Mason, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here next month. On Tuesday, September 10th at noon, Sidney Blumenthal will tell us about his recently released Volume 3 of the biography of Abraham Lincoln, All the Powers of Earth, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 1856 to 1863. And on Monday, September 16th at 7, Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch will tell us about his new book, A Republic If You Can Keep It, in which he explores the essential aspects of the Constitution and the importance of civic education, civil discourse, and mutual respect. Check our website at archives.gov or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. And you can check out their website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about the organization and to join online. Upstairs in the rotunda for the Charters of Freedom, two murals commemorate two founding documents of our nation, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. In the mural depiction of the Constitution, the central group of figures represents those who played key roles in the creation of that document. Along with George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin is George Mason, one of the five most frequent speakers at the Constitutional Convention. But at the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in September 1789, Mason did not sign the document. His primary objection, the lack of a Declaration of Individual Rights, led to the creation of the third charter in the rotunda, the Bill of Rights. Today we look forward to hearing more about George Mason's critical role in the formation of our nation from his biographer, William Hyland. William G. Hyland Jr., a native of Virginia, is the author of four widely praised historical biographies, including In Defense of Thomas Jefferson, which was nominated for the Virginia Literary Award. He's also written Long Journey with Mr. Jefferson, a biography of famed Jeffersonian historian Dumas Malone, and Martha Jefferson, An Intimate Life with Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Hyland is a litigation attorney with the national firm of Vernus and Bowling, with nearly 30 years of high-profile trial experience. He is also an adjunct professor of law at Stetson University College of Law and teaches an undergraduate course in political science. His professional lectures have included speeches at the National Archives and Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. He's a member of the Virginia and New York Historical Societies and serves on the board of directors of the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society. Please welcome William Hyland Jr.
Thank you, and thank you to the Archives for inviting me back. This is my third time back here, and I enjoy my visits back here because I really feel a closeness of history when I come back here. It really gives me chills to know that the three most important documents in our founding history are just 200 feet above us. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. And I very much feel close to history when I come here. As Mr. Ferrier told you, and Doug Swanson, I want to thank again for inviting me. I am a lawyer by practice, and I always start off my speeches telling a story about lawyers. Even though George Mason was not a lawyer, he had a wealth of legal knowledge, but he did not go to law school like Jefferson and Madison. But this is a story that I want to tell about a lawyer, a doctor, a priest, and a little boy. They were all on a small plane, and riding together, the small plane developed a little engine trouble, The pilot said, "We're having trouble, everyone's going to have to bail out." Everyone for himself. He grabbed a parachute and jumped out. The doctor grabbed the first parachute and said, "I am a doctor, I save lives, so I must live." And he jumped out with the first parachute. The lawyer came along. Lawyers are the most important people in the world. Thus, I must live. Grabbed the parachute, jumped out. Priest looked at the little boy. There was only one parachute left, said, "My son, I've lived a long and prosperous life. You have your whole life ahead of you. Take the last parachute and take off." The little boy turned to the priest and said, "No worries, Father. The smartest man in the world just took off with my backpack." Let's talk about George Mason. Not a lot of people know about George Mason. They basically know the George Mason University, maybe the Final Four that they reached a few years ago, but they have no idea who George Mason is. And I hope my book changes that opinion. If Thomas Jefferson was a genius, both professionally and personally, which he was, then his mentor, George Mason, was a near genius. America was woven together on three revered pieces of paper: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. George Mason had a hand in formulating, writing the blueprints for all three documents. In 1776, Mason emerged as a revolutionary and left an indelible footprint as one of the ablest constitutionalists of all time. In historian Ralph Ketchum's opinion, quote, "Mason became generally acknowledged as Virginia's premier Republican theorist, even though he never attended college or law school, but was self-taught in his uncle's 1,500-volume library in Virginia." Yet Mason's true enduring legacy was the creation of the American experiment, the nation's capacity to create hope in a world suffused in fear. The sum of Mason's keen writings is an opposing accomplishment. Yet in each instant, Mason's individual work was absorbed by a political coalition and his name lost to public fame. Anonymity, however, was more than a byproduct of the character of his historical work. It also became a matter of preference for Mason. His advice to his sons was, quote, "to prefer the happiness and independence and a private station to the troubles and vexations of a public business." That was an advice he followed all his life. Efforts of his colleagues to elect him to office were met with persistent refusals on his part. Yet his cool and detailed constitutional orations hypnotized many elected audiences. As one scholar concluded, George Mason was a thinker and advisor rather than a publicist. My biography of Mason is neither patriotic haze nor a free fall into Mason idolatry. It is a broad portrait of Mason and the world in which he lived. While not scanting his vibrant intellectual life, I have tried to gather anecdotal accounts that will bring this brilliant man to life for the public. The resulting portrait, I hope, will offer a fresh and surprising interpretation even to those best versed in the literature of the Revolutionary period. I hope my book blended together the political and personal sides of Mason's story, leaving one with the inevitable conclusion: George Mason deserves careful and renewed focus. Full historical notoriety has not been accorded to George Mason. He has tended to lack the multi-volumed biographies that have burnished the other founders, and in my view has not been accorded the fame that is due him. Every fact bearing upon the character and service of Mason whose visionary mental gifts help create a model form of government, should receive a warm greeting from the public and those who are interested in the origins of individual freedoms. Mason grasped the conception of true liberty. His philosophy of the authority of the citizens to control the government seemed thorough and complete. Yet his great labors are not as widely known or established in the public mind as some of the other founders. Mason's hashed out blueprint for the Declaration of Independence, which was his Virginia Declaration of Rights, was said by one historian to have, quote, more wisdom and concentration of thought in one sentence of it than in all former writings on the subject. Pretty powerful words. It is a little-known fact that Mason was personally responsible for the famous words in the final version of Jefferson's eloquent Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were Mason's own words written a month before Jefferson penned his eloquent version of the Declaration of Independence. Mason added the words to the Constitution giving Congress the power to, quote, declare, not, quote, make war. He also supplied the phrases aid and comfort in the definition of treason, and he wrote the famous words high crimes and misdemeanors in the impeachment clause. Most people don't know that. Along with Madison, Mason also wrote major portions of the oath of office that the modern president takes when sworn in today. Quite simply, given the length and breadth of Mason's political writings and influence, his name should be more recognizable in the public domain and in the same context as with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Mason's pragmatic mind minted constitutional principles and infused them with expansive life, turning abstract theory into government realities. And Mason never wavered on his core cherished convictions, individual rights and liberty over governmental power. Yet both Jefferson and Madison changed their views within the political climate of the times, suffering from what one prominent historian termed, quote, a disarming ideological promiscuity. Unfortunately, history has consigned Mason to the second tier of historical significance. The goal of my book is not to take the recognition away from Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton, but to assign more credit to Mason. As Jefferson himself admitted, his authorship of the Declaration of Independence was, quote, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. In effect, Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights emerged as Jefferson's brilliant and eloquent blueprint, if not first draft, of the Declaration of Independence. Mason's layered personality also played a notable part in so many important fields of intellectual thought, including government, law, the free exercise of religion, agriculture, architecture, and philosophy. He was among American authors of Rights and Independence whose elegant articulations of the American creed articulated a vision and set the course for history. Yet he remained a somewhat reclusive figure up until the American Revolutionary War, a war that precipitated his constitutional brilliance. The war for independence did not progress swiftly. As England's oppressive course became national policy toward the colonies, Mason met it with a resolution no less fixed and expressed in forceful language. He wrote that, quote, though we are England's subjects, we will use every means which heaven hath given us to prevent our becoming its slaves. With Mason's commanding strength of intellect, he became aroused by the emotional appeal and vigor of words. All is at stake, he wrote to Washington, and the little conveniences and comforts of life, when set in competition with our liberty, ought to be rejected, not with reluctance, but with pleasure. Mason was not a bold commander like Washington, nor a fiery orator like Patrick Henry, but gained his chief fame as the draftsman of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He rarely had a national audience outside of his country, Virginia, and only the slow passage of time revealed the full significance of his proposals. Yet Mason did not rest once his words were written or his ideas circulated. He was a builder and a dissenter and architect of the American Bill of Rights, which one scholar called arguably the most creative and consequential act of political leadership in American history. Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights affirmed our modern fundamental freedoms: the right to free press, the right to a jury trial, the right to not to self-incriminate you. These were all Mason's words written 12 years before the Constitution was written. They became the blueprint for the first 10 amendments known as our Bill of Rights. It was Mason, not Jefferson, not Madison, not Hamilton, who wrote the first version of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And I found that to be amazing. These were Mason's famous words, quote, again, 12 years before the Constitution was even written. Quote, these are Mason's words on the Second Amendment. Quote, a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That's his wife, Ann Mason, who died at the age of 39. Mason's loved and adored his wife Anne and their 12 children, and he had 25 grandchildren. He also loved his books, his estate, good wine, architecture, horseback riding, hunting, fishing, history, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the very latest in farming ideas. At Gunston Hall, the home he built on Dogue's Neck, Mason discovered the pleasures of scholarly pursuit were an alternating world of quiet and solitude with the family bustle that proved to be his desirable tonic. A devoted family man, unlike some other founders that we know, that was never a hint or suspicion of smarm involving his personal life. Indeed, it is not possible to fully understand Mason's intensity for liberty, sacrifice, and virtue, words that had explicit meaning in the 18th century, apart from his family. Examination of surviving letters and documents at Gunston Hall reveal a caring husband and doting father. His son's recollections give us an additional window into the private life of Mason at Gunston Hall. Mason never ceased to prefer the companionship of a superior mind and prized good manners. Although born privileged, he opposed all the trappings of an aristocratic society. He believed in America and in Americans. Liberty was his chief concern. Individual freedom was his chief concern. The freedom of the spirit, the freedom of the mind. Mason, although he did not attend college, was a cultivated gentleman. He did not attend college or law school, like I said, with Jefferson or with Madison. Mason emerged, though, as a lifelong advocate of education for all in proportion to their merit. To call him a votive of the Enlightenment is the best way to sum up his thoughts. Mason's political strength lay in his many friendships among the leaders of all shades of political vigor. One of his best friends was, of course, George Washington. And in fact, they had a tremendous falling out after Mason refused to sign the Constitution, and that ended their 30-year friendship. Mason assumed responsibilities by virtue of his towering intellect. At times, he may have seemed remote, even cloistered, and his sensitivities to criticism were recognized by some as a character flaw. But his colleagues also recognized Mason as a devoted family man and loyal friend, assets in any private circle. Mason's industry could not be questioned. Though he did not become a soldier during the war due to age and health, he was recognized by his peers as a man of capacity and courage. It seemed almost impossible for George Mason to be familiar to anyone outside of his immediate family. Mason concentrated his attention on his large family, not on posterity. His personal papers are not voluminous compared to the official papers of Jefferson, Washington, and Madison. The definitive edition of Mason's papers run a comparatively scant 3 volumes. The diversion derives from both politics and family considerations. Both George Mason and Patrick Henry curtailed their political careers after the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788. So they amassed far fewer papers than the first 3 presidents. In 1820, Mason's grandson, George Mason VI, began to correspond with prominent men who knew his grandfather, including James Madison. Madison sympathized with the young man's struggle to gather the papers. He said and wrote of Mason's achievements, quote, that highly distinguished as he was, accounts are more scanty than of many of his contemporaries, far inferior to him in intellectual powers and in public services. Although some have largely dismissed Mason as a man who simply refused to sign the Constitution, this is not, in my view, a historically accurate picture of Mason. His generosity was unmatched when it came to his family, solicited to his beloved mother while she was still alive, as well to his younger brother and sister. By adulthood, he had already begun to be a voracious collector of books. He cultivated the arts, sciences, and agriculture. And even though he lost his dear wife, Anne, at the age of 39, and his lifelong friendship with George Washington over his objections to the Constitution, Mason believed in the fundamental goodness of life. Close study of surviving documents and letters have revealed Mason's intricate character. Those who have commented on Mason's life have captioned him as a reluctant statesman, a gentleman revolutionary, or the man who did not sign the Constitution. Indeed, he may be all of these things. But an examination of his public career reveals a broad picture of political contributions that spanned his entire adult life. It discloses his talents and persistence as a writer and a reformer, a legislator and a representative, a militia officer, a local church parish vestry, a trustee for the town of Alexandria, a treasurer of his Western Land Speculation Company, the Ohio Company. It is unfortunate that Mason is remembered best as the dissenting delegate to quote the federal Constitution as it was called in 1787 in Philadelphia. He was one of 3 men who did not sign the Constitution with Elbridge Gerry and Edmund Randolph. He refused to sign the final document that he perceived sanctioned human slavery for the next 20 years. The Constitution had a compromise for the importation of slaves for another 20 years, and he objected to that vigorously. But his main objection to the Constitution was the omission of a Bill of Rights. There was no Bill of Rights for the people, he said, and that is the fundamental reason he did not sign the Constitution. The first 6 words of his now famous objections to the Constitution he wrote at the convention were heard in every town and every village. There is no Declaration of Rights. He carried his struggle for a federal Bill of Rights to the people, and he lived barely long enough to see his efforts crowned with congressional victory, the monumental Bill of Rights. Although professional historians are familiar with Mason's legacy, it seems that his name has drowned in public obscurity. He is by far one of the most unknown figures in American history, a remote, enigmatic man more respected by revolutionary scholars than known by the general public. The perception that pervades history is that Mason seemed to lack the folksy appeal of Benjamin Franklin, the robust dominance of George Washington, or the personal charms of Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Mason has receded so much in our collective memory that he has become nothing more than a modest bronze statue here in Washington, D.C. However, in his own time and place, his contemporaries grasped at superlatives to describe George Mason. Madison exuded that, quote, Mason possessed the greatest talents for debate of any man I have ever seen, heard, or speak. Patrick Henry pronounced him, quote, the greatest statesman I ever knew. Jefferson complimented his mind as, quote, great and powerful. Philip Mazzei, the Florentine physician and world traveler, met Mason in Williamsburg within days of arriving in America. Mazzei said, in my opinion, Mason is not well known enough. He is one of those brave, rare, talented men who cause nature a great effort to produce. The Italian ranked Mason as one of the intellectual giants, writing that, quote, Mason is one of those strong, very rare intellects which are created only by a special effort of nature, like that of a Machiavelli, a Galileo, a Newton, end quote. Most people know little of Mason's private life and family life. The private world of Hamilton and Jefferson have recently attracted a great deal of attention and ink. My book re-examines George Mason by telling his personal as well as his political journey while probing his 18th century world. It also touches on his significant contributions to our political lives and liberty. Mason became a leading Virginian before, during, and after the American Revolution, who at great personal cost confronted the entangled history of slavery in an era of political revolution. What I hope to establish is the case for Mason's elevated public fame, placing him among the most famous of American founders for both civil rights and freedom of religion. James Madison gets credit for the Bill of Rights, whereas he initially opposed the concept and agreed to support such a document only as a last resort. George Mason, by contrast, has been brushed aside as an opponent of the Constitution, whereas the truth is that he was a major intellectual contributor to its creation. Except for Madison, probably no one contributed more to the actual document than did George Mason. He rightly deserves to be considered one of the fathers of our national government. Indeed, our greatest political documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, to the Constitution, all form a series of concentric circles leading back to George Mason. In my view, Mason should emerge as one of the preeminent literary architects of the American Revolution. Most Americans should read his Declaration of Rights and his later Virginia Constitution as part of the common stock of political and journalistic discourse. Mason had the sharp mind of Jefferson, the determination of Washington, the literary skills of Madison, and the personality and grumpy temperament of John Adams. A man seemingly lost to the general public, Mason's life congealed in the most tangled political period in U.S. history. Why then is Mason not among the sacred gallery of famed patriots? It is lamentable that most Americans do not know Mason as well as they should, especially when we reflect on who he was and what he achieved. Virginia Scion, devoted husband and father of 12 children, 25 grandchildren, farmer, philosopher, botanist, amateur musician, fluent in 2 languages, architect of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and one of the strongest proponents in America of religious liberty in history. You know, losers receive little credit from history. Most historical impressions of Mason depict him as a grumpy old patriot who lost his political arguments in Philadelphia, then took his pen and quill and went home. And that's why he refused to sign. Mason is shown to be, in my book, to be a compassionate, sensitive, well-read boy who matured into an accomplished statesman, devoted husband, and father. Jefferson never made a secret of the fact that he revered George Mason. The sage of Monticello called him the wisest man of his generation. Jefferson's famed biographer, Dumas Malone, agreed, summarizing Mason's marquee contributions to the Revolution when he said, quote, Mason charted the rights of human beings much more fully than Jefferson did in the immortal but necessarily compressed paragraph in the more famous document, referring to the Declaration of Rights. Of the contemporary impact of Mason's declaration, Malone went on to say, there can be no possible question. More than any other single American, did you hear that? More than any other single American, George Mason may be regarded as the herald of this new era. Quite simply, Mason developed into a private man of Renaissance interests, but with an abiding conviction deep inside him. The fate of individual liberty, individual freedom was paramount to governmental power. He believed individual freedom was a natural right. Individual liberty was a natural right. He wrote in his Virginia Declaration of Rights, quote, all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. That government is, ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. Mason's oratory and literary skills helped propel the colonies towards independence. He drafted and imbued some of the most creative and consequential political texts in revolutionary history. Yet history has anointed others with fame while Mason has languished in relative obscurity. I hope this gulf separating Mason's recognition from his political contemporaries will be abundantly clear at the end of my biography. It is said that biography ends with death. However, as did most great statesmen, Mason thought of the next generation. Had he lived longer, perhaps he could have found a viable solution for the next generation to end slavery, an institution he condemned in the most stringent of terms, yet he never freed his own slaves. I hope to have presented Mason so the reader can feel the patriot, the father, the husband, the farmer, the scholar. No doubt he seemed a hard man to know intimately and still is, but it must have seemed a privilege to know him then as it does now. I also hope my biography will invite the reader to define patriotism as Mason did in his time, in his broadest sense, while appreciating the need as well as the necessity of political debate in a free society. As one historian eloquently concluded, quote, "In historic evaluations, actions speak louder than words. Emulation rather than rhetorical evaluation by men and women of wisdom and virtue is the better test," end quote. By that rule, let Mason be judged. Finally, George Mason's true importance is to be found in the public achievements, the rights of the human spirit, life, and liberty. In the final analysis, Mason's political authorship should make him an enduring historical figure. Like Jefferson with his literary brilliance, Mason's Declaration of Rights should be considered a monumental and important text. He lived one of the most eventful, colorful, and consequential lives of all time. From beyond this earth, his lasting written principles shield mankind from, quote, the lash of tyrants. As eloquently expressed by one scholar, Mason's final legacy suggests political genius. Quote, "Those who carry the torch of freedom are soon forgotten, perhaps to be rediscovered centuries later." Mason's moving words and deeds offer an abiding, potent legacy on individual liberties and constitutional government, which in my view will have few equals. Thank you very much. And I'll be glad to take any questions. I think you just have to move to the podium. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I was struck when you quoted Mason's draft of the Second Amendment, which became in the Second Amendment. And as I heard you say that, quote it, it didn't appear that there was an individual right to bear arms. Is that a correct interpretation?
That was his original words, but he believed in individual, the right to the individuals to bear arms. Mason's major goal and major objection to the Constitution was that he was afraid of another George III. He was afraid that the new government would turn into a tyranny. So he believed in individual rights, individual liberty, but he believed that the individual had the right to arm them, even though he did not put that in the actual document. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. The very last phrase that you just said rings potent in my ears right now. And it said, to shield mankind from the lash of tyrants. How do you think Mason might view the development and integration of artificial intelligence into our society? Would he view this inevitability as a potential threat to individual human rights?
I have no idea. Artificial intelligence, that's a great subject. Even though Mason was near a genius and Thomas Jefferson was a genius, I don't think they thought that far in advance, quite frankly. But again, going back to his main clarion call was for individual rights and individual liberty. He was against anything of the government intruding on the individual's rights and the individual's liberty. Maybe he would think that would be a governmental intrusion, artificial intelligence. I don't know. But I will say, one of his major calls, his major concerns was a freedom of the press. So he would believe very strongly in a freedom of the press, freedom of expression as far as that.
You seem to be extremely familiar. You've done your research. Do you think that he might feel a need to define individual now as organic?
Again, I have no idea. I just have no idea how he would think about that.
I really appreciate your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Can you tell us the reasons why those brilliant men who wrote the Constitution and who knew about the ideas in the Declaration of Rights, men like Madison, why did these writers initially object to and reject the ideas of the Declaration of Rights, which they eventually agreed to in the Bill of, which ratification required in the Bill of Rights?
That's a great question, and that goes to the very essence of the disagreement between Mason and Washington and Madison at the convention. Washington and Madison thought a Declaration of Rights, a Bill of Rights, was superfluous to the Constitution. They thought that anything that wasn't in the Constitution referred back to or inured back to the states, and that they did not need a document to say that there was natural rights, individual liberty. They believed that it was superfluous. Mason completely disagreed, and so did Patrick Henry. He wanted an individual document appended to the Constitution enumerating these Bill of Rights: the right to a jury trial, the right to a free press, the right to free expression. He believed that that should be written out. Washington and Madison thought that was superfluous and it was already inherent in the Constitution. Yes, sir.
You may have hinted at the answer to this question just now, but in Virginia politics at the time, was Mason more closely aligned with Jefferson and Madison or with Patrick Henry?
Jefferson, he was closely and mentored Jefferson, and he was a colleague of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry and him teamed up in the Virginia ratifying convention to try and defeat or at least get a Bill of Rights appended to the new Constitution. So he was a mentor to Jefferson, but he was a political ally of Patrick Henry at the Virginia ratifying convention. And in fact, with him, Patrick Henry was one of the most vociferous objectors to the Constitution. They came within, I think, 3 or 4 votes in the Virginia ratifying convention of defeating the Constitution, by the way. Yes, sir.
Thank you. In the Bill of Rights and the compromising that probably took place to pass that, were there any particular rights that were, if you will, on Mason and Henry's original list that did not survive the process?
Yes, there were approximately 24, I believe, amendments at the Virginia ratifying convention that were actually sent to Congress. James Madison expertly, and I give him credit, basically edited these amendments down to be really the modern version of the Bill of Rights. But there were many different conventions going on at the time. You have to remember that 9 states had to ratify the Constitutional Convention. So almost each state had their own set of amendments. but I believe there were approximately 24 that came out of the Virginia ratifying convention. But going back again to Mason's major concerns, his major freedom, he thought the freedom of the press was an absolute fundamental.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You
Yes, sir.
mentioned Mason's access to an extensive family library. Was there any indication as to what political thinkers or philosophers may have impacted his thinking most?
Absolutely. In fact, I have one chapter in the book that's devoted exclusively to that. He read extensively in his uncle John Mercer's library, 1,500 volumes, but he read all the English jurists. Locke had a major influence on him, but Montesquieu is what he read the most. And Montesquieu really gave him the idea of the separation of powers, that there should be three branches of government. But that is why his own colleagues thought he was the ablest constitutionalist in Virginia, because he was so well read, so versed on all the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights in 1689, the Magna Carta, Rousseau's writings, Locke's writings, and that's why he really was a genius, because he knew and had read all of these constitutions before. Well, I think that does it for questions. Oh, you got one more?
I had a question about the Second Amendment and the role slavery played as opposed to militia or defense, personal defense. The right to bear arms, in other words, is the right to hold slavery.
I'm not sure he found those two to be tied together, but again, one of his basic fundamental differences, and one of the reasons he did not sign the Constitution was because there was a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between the northern and southern states, and it basically sustained the importation of slavery for the next 20 years. He was voraciously against slavery. He wrote about slavery, and he just thought it was an abomination. He abhorred it. But, like Jefferson, he did not know how to solve the problem of slavery in his lifetime. He basically kicked it down the road to the next generation. But that was one of the main reasons he did not sign the Constitution, because it sustained the compromise for importing slaves for 20 more years. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Could you please fill us in a little bit more on his education? Did he have a tutor? How old was he when he really started? Well, you said something about collecting books. And also his age with regards to Jefferson and the other people he was working with, because you said his wife died at 39. How old was he? And please.
Yeah, well, he was 67 when he died. He was about 15 years older than both Madison and Jefferson at the time. He did have tutors as a child, but like George Washington, and one of the things they did have in common was both of their fathers died when they were very young boys at the age of 10. So he really did not have a mentor, so to speak, growing up. So his uncle, John Mercer, who was a lawyer, had a vast library, over 1,500 volumes of English law, Coke, Montesquieu, Locke, things like that. So he really was under the tutelage after his father died of his uncle, John Mercer. And John Mercer basically taught him to become a lawyer, to become a jurist, to become a scholar. So that was really his main mentor, was his uncle, and reading from the age of 11 all of these various volumes. But one of the interesting things, you did mention his wife, he did remarry 7 years after his wife died, a second marriage. and they did not have children, but at the time of the death of his wife, he had 12 children to raise by himself. Thank you. I think that's it. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.